The quiet hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, had seen their share of tragedies, but none quite like the death of Zona Heastershoe. It wasn't just the circumstances of her passing that sent whispers through the town. It was what came after. In January 1897, Zona, a young woman in her early 20s, had married Edward Shue, a blacksmith who had only recently arrived in Greenbrier. He was charming, handsome, and seemed devoted to her, but something about their rushed marriage unsettled Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster. Mothers often had instincts about these things, an unspoken sense when something was wrong. And in this case, Mary Jane's unease would prove to be more than justified. Just weeks into the marriage, tragedy struck. One cold afternoon, Edward sent a young boy to his home on an errand. The boy hesitated as he knocked on the door, waiting for an answer. When none came, he let himself inside. What he saw made him freeze. Zona's lifeless body lay sprawled at the bottom of the staircase, her long hair fanned out around her, her head twisted unnaturally to one side. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly into nothing. The boy turned and ran, his screams echoing through the quiet countryside. By the time the doctor arrived, Edward was already at his wife's side. He had lifted Zona's body into bed and dressed her himself, a highly unusual act at the time, as it was customary for women of the community to prepare the dead. But Edward insisted, forcing her into a high-collared dress that concealed her neck. Throughout the doctor's examination, Edward held Zona's body close, sobbing and rocking back and forth. When the doctor attempted to examine her further, Edward erupted into loud wails of grief, refusing to let anyone near her. Feeling pressured, the doctor hastily ruled the cause of death as everlasting faint, a vague diagnosis that essentially meant she had died suddenly, with no obvious explanation. Later, it was changed to complications from childbirth, though there was no evidence that she had been pregnant. Zona was buried quickly, and though the town mourned, the unease in Mary Jane Heaster's heart only grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then the dreams began. For 4 nights in a row, Mary Jane was awakened by an unshakable feeling of being watched. The air in her room would grow heavy, the temperature dropping as an eerie presence filled the space. Then, in the darkness, she saw her daughter. Zona stood at the foot of her bed, her face pale, her eyes full of sorrow. At first, she said nothing, but on the second night, she began to speak. "Mother, he killed me," she whispered. Mary Jane's breath caught in her throat. Zona continued, her voice hollow and distant, as if carried from another world. She told her mother the truth, that Edward had been cruel, prone to violent outbursts, that he had lashed out at her that night over something trivial, his rage uncontrollable. And then she told her mother how she had died. "He grabbed me by the throat and squeezed," Zona said, her voice a mere echo in the dark. "He crushed my windpipe, broke my neck." Mary Jane watched in horror as Zona slowly turned her head, farther and farther, until it lay at an unnatural angle. Then, as suddenly as she had come, she vanished. Mary Jane sat awake until dawn, trembling, her mind racing. The next night, Zona returned again, repeating her story, and the next. By the 4th night, Mary Jane had no doubts left. She had to act. She stormed into the prosecutor's office, demanding her daughter's body be exhumed. She told them everything: the ghostly visitations, the confession, the terrible truth. The prosecutor, skeptical at first, had already harbored his own doubts about Zona's death. Edward's strange behavior during the funeral had raised suspicions. He had insisted on covering her neck with a scarf, despite no apparent reason for it. He had refused to let anyone get too close, even breaking into fits of wailing whenever someone approached the casket. With the mother's pleas and the doctor's flimsy cause of death, the prosecutor agreed to order an exhumation. Zona's body was unearthed and examined thoroughly this time. What they found shocked everyone. Her windpipe was crushed. The ligaments in her neck were torn. Her vertebrae were snapped at an unnatural angle. Zona's ghost had told the truth. Edward Shue was arrested immediately. His past, which had remained hidden from the townsfolk, soon came to light. He had been married twice before. His first wife had left him, citing abuse, and his second wife had died under mysterious circumstances. At trial, the evidence against Edward was overwhelming. Neighbors testified about his odd behavior, the scarf he had wrapped around Zona's neck, his refusal to let anyone near her body. The doctor admitted he had been unable to properly examine her because of Edward's interference. But the most shocking testimony came from Mary Jane herself. She took the stand and, under oath, recounted her daughter's ghostly visits in vivid detail. She spoke of the chilling nights, the sorrow in Zona's voice, the final terrifying moment when she had turned her head to reveal the cause of her death. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Some believed her story completely. Others whispered that it was mere hysteria, a grieving mother clinging to desperate visions. But whether the jury believed in ghosts or not, the forensic evidence was irrefutable. Edward Shue was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He never admitted to the crime, nor did he ever express remorse. He died behind bars just a few years later, alone and forgotten. Zona's ghost was never seen again. To this day, the case of the Greenbrier ghost remains the only time in U.S. history where the testimony of a spirit was credited with solving a crime. Did Zona truly return from beyond the grave to name her murderer? Or was it a mother's unshakable love and intuition that forced justice to be served? No one can say for certain. But in the quiet hills of Greenbrier County, some still whisper that on cold winter nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the faint echo of Zona's voice, forever lingering in the wind, ensuring her story is never forgotten. Chicago, 1977. The winter air clung to the city like a heavy blanket, the streets buzzing with the usual rhythm of life. But in one quiet apartment on North Pine Grove Avenue, something unspeakable had happened. Something that would defy logic, haunt investigators, and lead to one of the strangest murder cases in American history. Teresita Basa, a 47-year-old respiratory therapist at Edgewater Hospital, was found dead in her home on February 21st. Firefighters responding to what seemed like a routine apartment fire discovered her body beneath a smoldering mattress. She had been stripped, stabbed in the chest, and set ablaze, an apparent attempt to destroy any evidence of the crime. But there were no obvious suspects, no signs of forced entry. The case quickly went cold, until Teresita herself decided otherwise. Months after the murder, one of Teresita's colleagues, Remivia's Remy Chua, started experiencing terrifying disturbances. At first, it was just an eerie sense of being watched. Then came the dreams, vivid, suffocating nightmares where Teresita appeared, staring at her with pleading eyes. And then something even more disturbing happened. One night, as Remy sat with her husband, Joe, in their home, she suddenly went rigid. Her breathing changed, her posture slumped, and when she finally spoke, it was not in her own voice. Her husband's blood ran cold as he heard the words leave her lips. "My name is Teresita Basa." Remy's voice was different, lower, distant, burdened by something unnatural. She turned to Joe, her expression blank, and continued speaking in the same eerie tone. "The man who murdered me is Alan Showery." Joe, a rational man, struggled to make sense of what he was hearing. He shook Remy, trying to snap her out of it, but she only grew more insistent. "He stole my jewelry. He gave it to his girlfriend." And then, as suddenly as it began, the possession ended. Remy blinked, disoriented, with no memory of what had just happened. Shaken but desperate for answers, Joe convinced her to go to the police. The detectives listening to Remy's story were skeptical. They had heard of unusual informants before, but this was something else entirely. A ghost speaking through a coworker, naming her own killer. It was absurd. But then, they checked the name. Alan Showery was real. And he wasn't just anyone. He had worked at the same hospital as Teresita. With no physical evidence linking him to the murder, detectives hesitated. But then Remy, once again under Teresita's influence, gave them more. He took my jewelry. Go to his apartment. His girlfriend has it. Faced with nothing to lose, detectives decided to investigate. When they arrived at Showery's home, they questioned his girlfriend. At first, she denied everything. But when detectives mentioned the jewelry, her demeanor shifted. Slowly, hesitantly, she retrieved several pieces of gold and handed them over. They had belonged to Teresita. With this damning evidence, police confronted Showery. At first, he denied any involvement. But as the questioning continued, his confidence cracked. The pressure was too much. He confessed. Alan Showery admitted that he had gone to Teresita's apartment that night, intending to rob her. He knew she lived alone. He knew she had money. He had strangled her, stabbed her, and set her body on fire to destroy the evidence. He had stolen her jewelry and given it to his girlfriend as a gift, thinking no one would ever know. But Teresita knew, and she made sure justice was served. Showery was arrested and charged with murder. The case shocked the nation, not only because of the brutal crime, but because of how it was solved. During the trial, the prosecutors carefully avoided mentioning the supernatural elements of the case. Instead, they focused on the recovered jewelry and Showery's confession. The defense, however, wasn't afraid to bring it up. They pointed out the absurdity of a ghost solving her own murder. Was it coincidence, a lucky guess, or had Remy known more than she let on? The jury wrestled with the case for days, but ultimately, they could not ignore the evidence. Alan Showery was convicted of murder. Even after the case was closed, the eerie truth remained. How had Remy known the details of the murder? How had she named the right man? How had she described the stolen jewelry, down to the last piece? Skeptics argued that Remy must have overheard something at work, or that she had unconsciously pieced together details from rumors. But those who knew her best, those who saw her in the throes of possession, her voice and mannerisms shifting into something unnatural, were not so sure. Had Teresita Basa truly returned from beyond the grave to name her killer? Or had something darker, something unexplainable, spoken through Remy that night? No one could say for certain. But one thing was clear: the dead do not always rest quietly, and sometimes they demand justice. The Bell family never sought attention. They were simple farmers living in Adams, Tennessee in the early 1800s, far removed from the supernatural horrors that would later define their name. Their days were filled with hard work, their nights with rest, until the disturbances began. At first, they were small, almost laughable. Strange scratching noises echoed within the walls. Blankets were tugged off sleeping children, and eerie whispers filled the air in the dead of night. John Bell, the family patriarch, dismissed these events as the sounds of an aging house and the tricks of an overactive imagination. But as the days passed, the disturbances grew stronger, more relentless, and impossible to ignore. The whispers soon turned into voices, mimicking the family members, laughing at them, calling their names when no one else was in the room. Objects began moving on their own, chairs sliding across the floor, doors slamming shut without warning. The animals on their farm grew restless, their normally obedient horses rearing up in fear, cows refusing to eat, dogs barking at empty air as though some unseen force stood before them. Then came the attacks. One night, young Betsy Bell awoke with a sharp cry. Her family rushed to her side and found her clutching her face, eyes wide with terror. Red handprints, as though burned into her skin, marred her cheeks. She had been slapped, not by a human hand, but by something unseen, something powerful. The presence in their home was no longer content to be a mere trickster. It had turned violent. Neighbors heard of the strange occurrences and came to witness them for themselves, but even they were not spared. Some claimed to feel invisible hands pinching them, pushing them, whispering words they could not understand. The force identified itself, but its answers were never the same. Sometimes it claimed to be the spirit of a restless soul, other times it called itself a witch, and at times, something far more ancient, something malevolent. But one thing remained consistent. It despised John Bell. It called him Old Jack in a mocking tone, swore that it would never leave his home, and most chillingly, it vowed to kill him. As weeks turned into months, John Bell's health began to decline. His throat swelled at random, making it difficult for him to eat or speak. He felt a crushing weight on his chest at times, as though unseen hands were squeezing the air from his lungs. The entity, known now as the Bell Witch, delighted in his suffering, taunting him relentlessly, whispering of his impending death. Even outsiders came to witness the haunting. News of the Bell Witch spread beyond Adams, reaching as far as military figures. One such visitor was the future President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. Curious about the stories, he arrived at the Bell farm with a group of men, determined to uncover the truth. But the moment they set foot on the property, their horses refused to move. The animals trembled, their eyes wild with fear, as though some invisible force held them in place. Then, without warning, their supplies were thrown into the air by unseen hands, weapons jammed and malfunctioned, and disembodied laughter echoed through the fields. Legend has it that Jackson left that very night, saying he would rather face an entire army than spend another moment with the Bell Witch. By 1820, John Bell was a broken man, both physically and mentally. His health had deteriorated beyond explanation, his body frail, his spirit weakened. Then, one cold morning, his family found him lying in bed, unresponsive, his breathing shallow, his skin pale. Near his bedside, they discovered a small dark vial filled with a black liquid. Panic spread through the household. No one knew what it was, but the Bell Witch did. The entity's voice rang out, triumphant and cruel, declaring, "I gave old Jack a dose last night, and he'll never wake again." Desperate for answers, one of John's sons took a small drop of the liquid and fed it to the family cat. The animal convulsed violently before collapsing, dead within moments. Horrified, the family threw the vial into the fireplace, where it erupted into blue flames and vanished. John Bell died later that day, and the Bell Witch celebrated. Even as mourners gathered to pay their respects, the entity did not remain silent. Laughter filled the air during John Bell's funeral, mocking the grief-stricken family, singing loudly as though it were rejoicing in its victory. The people of Adams had no doubt. John Bell had not died of natural causes. He had been murdered by something unseen, something beyond human understanding. But the terror did not end with his death. The Bell Witch remained, its presence lingering in the home, its whispers continuing to torment the family. It vowed to return in 7 years, and when that time came, the disturbances resumed, though not as violently as before. Then, before vanishing once more, the entity left one final warning. It would return in 107 years. No official records confirm another haunting, but the legend of the Bell Witch refuses to die. Even now, locals in Adams, Tennessee, claim that the presence never truly left. The land itself feels heavy. They say, the air thick with something unseen, something waiting. Some believe the Bell Witch still watches, biding its time, choosing when to make itself known once again. Today, visitors flock to the infamous Bell Witch Cave, a place believed to hold the last remnants of the spirit's presence. Many have reported hearing whispers in the darkness, feeling unseen hands brush against them, and catching glimpses of shadowy figures moving just out of sight. No one knows for certain what the Bell Witch truly was. A vengeful spirit, a demonic force, something older, something beyond human understanding. What is known, however, is that John Bell's death was only the beginning. And perhaps even now, the Bell Witch is still there, watching, waiting, ready to remind the world that some spirits refuse to rest.